Welcome, everyone. Do moral facts exist? Often, moral arguments move from the fact that moral facts exist to God as the best explanation of those facts. In the last couple of interviews I've done, I focused on the second half of that argument, that God is the best explanation of moral facts. But there are philosophers who deny the existence of moral facts. They're called error theorists. And so time needs to be spent defending moral facts if there is to be a moral argument. At least that's my take on it. So I've invited a philosopher onto the Crash Course Apologetics tonight. His name is Eric Sampson. I will bring him into the chat. Hey, Eric.
Hey.
So before we get started with the discussion, why don't you just tell us briefly about your background and how you became interested in philosophy?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. Love the channel. Love that it's taken the Christian apologetics and the moral side of things. I think that's a big hole in Christian apologetics. I'm glad to see you filling that. But my name is Eric Sampson. I'm a Ph.D. student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'll be a Ph.D. student for about 3 more months, and then I defend my dissertation in July. And then I will go to Georgetown University to start a postdoc there, a 2-year postdoc in DC, and hopefully after that get a job in philosophy. So I've been a grad student at UNC for 5 years, just finishing up my dissertation, but I'm originally from Nashville, Tennessee, and grew up in a religious household and interested in a lot of the big questions. And I went to the University of Tennessee to be a basketball coach and a high school economics teacher. But I started getting into debates about theology, especially the Calvinism-Arminianism debate, and started arguing with my friends about that kind of stuff. And, began reading text closely and offering arguments for views and defending my views against objections and offering objections to views, and realized that basically what I was doing was philosophy. So my junior year, I started late. I took my first philosophy class. Loved it, learned very quickly that apparently they pay people to go, teach philosophy courses. And if you're a grad student, they'll, pay your tuition and pay you a stipend to learn philosophy and teach undergrads philosophy. So I thought, wow, it's a really great idea. It's very similar to teaching high school. I can always go back and teach high school. So I started doing that, thinking I might go be a professor in philosophy. Turns out that's basically what happened. I've really enjoyed doing it. But it all started with basically theological debates that sort of eventually moved into to moral and more deeply philosophical debates.
Cool. All right. Well, I know we have a lot to discuss tonight, so I want to go ahead and jump into the papers that you wrote, which, by the way, I've put the link to both papers that we're going to be discussing in the description to this video. And I'm sure if you emailed Eric, he would be more than happy to share those with you. So they're really, really excellent. When I read them, I immediately messaged him and said, hey, I'm a big fan of your work now. This was really good, really well done. So I'm excited to discuss this. All right, so the thumbnail of this video is exposing the errors in error theory. So what I want to do very first is just define a few terms. What is error theory?
Yeah, so one way to get started on the error theory is just one way to talk about it is just moral nihilism. So it's the view that there is no such thing as goodness or badness, rightness or wrongness, justice or injustice, those sorts of things. Error theorists take the attitude towards morality that atheists take towards God. So atheists, they know that lots of people think that there's a God. They go around talking about what God told them to do or about what God is teaching them or stuff like that. But atheists just think, well, everybody who talks about God is making a mistake. They're in error. So all their claims about God and what he does and what he's like are all false, uniformly false. Well, the error theorist about morality just thinks the exact same thing. They think, yeah, I get that people talk about goodness and badness, rightness and wrongness, what governments ought to do and not do. But guess what? All of those claims are false, or at any rate, not true. So that's basically the view. I mean, you could characterize it more precisely like this. Error theorists in general endorse a view called cognitivism, which is a view about what our moral judgments are doing. So error theorists think that when we make a moral judgment, we say that when we say something that is right or wrong or good or bad, we're expressing a belief rather than just expressing some approval or disapproval or some desire. Some people think that all our moral judgments, when we say something is wrong, what we're really doing is just expressing our disapproval for that action. So if we say that murder is wrong, we're really just saying boo murder or something like that. So error theorists think, no, that's not right. We're expressing beliefs. They think that that moral claims, if they're to be true, have to be stance independently true. So they're not just merely claims about what we would desire or what our culture is like. No, they're like big, heavy-duty claims about about the structure of the universe. It's wrong, independent of our attitudes. And then there's the nihilism part, which is, well, there's nothing like that. So we're trying to represent moral reality as being a certain way, but we're just getting it wrong. So that's the more precise characterization of error theory.
Great. Who are some prominent moral error theorists?
So one of the first, people going by that name and endorsing that view is a guy named J.L. Mackie. So I actually have the error theorist books here. So he wrote a book called Ethics Inventing Right and Wrong, which I think was 77, 79, somewhere around there. So J.L. Mackie is sort of the guy. If you take a meta-ethics class, you'll read him very early in the semester. But also there's a guy named Richard Joyce, who's an Australian philosopher, I think. And he wrote a book called The Myth of Morality. So he's a very prominent error theorist. The book we're going to talk about today is by a guy named Jonas Olsen. It looks like Jonas. His name's Jonas Olsen. He's a Swedish philosopher. He wrote a book called Error Theory, History, Critique, Defense. And then recently, so error theory is kind of a big deal more recently. So that book came out in 2014, but recently in 2018, a book called Unbelievable Errors by Bart Sturmer has recently come out. And then another book in 2018, I think, by Wouter Kauf called Moral Error Theory. So these are the big error theorists right now. And error theory is sort of alive and well as we speak.
Well, I won't say great to that. I usually end by saying great. But it is good to at least deal with the views, know what's being said, have responses to it. So your meta-ethical position, though, is, or at least the one that you're interested in comparing and contrasting with error theory, is what you call non-skeptical moral realism. So in one of the papers in particular, the one on moral disagreement, you lay out kind of 4, I guess, conditions of what you mean when you say non-skeptical moral realism. You can lay those out, or if you have a simpler way of putting it, but what do you mean? What's, by your meta-ethical position, the moral realist position?
Yeah, a lot of people think that non-skeptical realism is basically the common sense view. It's the view that there are such a thing as right and wrong, good and bad, and it doesn't depend on anyone's attitude. So it's not the product of the culture or what people would agree to under certain conditions or what I think is right or anything like that. It's sort of non-skeptical moral realism is like the attitude many people have towards mathematics. That is, no one invents the moral truth or the mathematical truths. They're just sort of the way reality is structured. And when we make claims about mathematics, we're getting them right, and we're describing the way reality is. That's basically what realism is. So it's just like error theory. It's cognitivism. We're expressing beliefs. It's stance independence. These don't depend on anyone's attitudes. But the difference is that the realist is a non-nihilist. So where the error theory says, and there's nothing like that moral discourse is committed to, the realist says, and there are such truths out there. And the non-skeptical part is just that we can come to know the truth about those things, at least in some cases. It doesn't mean we're flawless, but at least in some cases we can come to know the truth. That's why it's non-skeptical normative realism.
Great. So if you're just joining us, I'll try to just summarize that, and you can give me a nod of approval if you think I'm on the right track. So tonight we are looking specifically at a premise in the moral argument, or the moral argument that I favor, that would say that there are some objective moral facts. Some things really are good, some things really are bad. There are philosophers out there who deny that. They're called error theorists. They also go by moral nihilists. So they think that there are no moral facts. There is nothing that's really good or objectively good, I should say, and objectively bad, or objectively right or objectively wrong. There's nothing like that, they would say. And tonight, I'm going to be discussing with Eric, we're going to be critiquing some arguments they give for that position, particularly two arguments. One of them is called the argument from moral disagreement, and then the second is the argument from queerness. So we're going to take the argument from moral disagreement first. Did I summarize that fair enough there, Eric?
Yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah, I just want to add, I mean, moral error theorists sort of two things, actually. One, it can sound like they're the kind of people, because they don't believe there's any such thing as right and wrong, so they just go around killing other people, or like not worried about killing other people. Believe it or not, I mean, moral error theorists is very strange, but they actually are pretty like, they at least conform to the moral norms that they don't think exist. For instance, I could just tell you, I know of two error theorists who are vegans because they don't like the suffering that animals endure. They know that it's not like objectively morally wrong that people eat meat or anything like that, but they don't like that animals endure suffering, and so they choose not to eat meat. That's because they don't like it. They don't like that animals suffer in that way. So they don't. I just want to say, one, they don't go around killing people, and two, they understand that people get very excited. So a lot of people, when they hear error theory, they're like, "What do you mean nothing's morally wrong? What do you go around like punching your kids or something like that?" They understand that people get very excited about morality, and they don't deny that people make moral claims or that they get sort of worked up about it. They just deny that any of those claims are true. Just like, with, as I said, with theism, people get very excited about religion, but atheists just think, yeah, I get that, but they're just wrong. So,
yeah. Okay. That is a good clarification. I hope I didn't. I hope
no, you didn't. I don't think you did imply that, but that's a thought that some people have. You didn't seem to have that thought, but it's out there. Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at this first argument that an error theorist can give. It's a very popular argument, at least it seems that way to a layman like me. It's a very popular argument for error theory, and that's the argument for moral disagreement. So you have a paper specifically on the argument for moral disagreement, and in that paper you mention a total of 4 different versions of the argument. 2 you say are epistemological, and then the other 2 are metaphysical. So we're going to look at these arguments, but before we do that, can you just explain the difference between those two terms, between epistemology and or epistemological and metaphysical?
Yeah, so that's right. So people give lots of different kinds of arguments from disagreement. What they all have in common is just this. They say, hey, people disagree like crazy about morality and politics, and given that they disagree and have done so for a very, very long time, it's not as though moral disagreement just cropped up. It's existed literally forever. Even moral philosophers can't agree about philosophy. So if you take a bunch of classes in ethics, you'll see moral philosophers, worse than anybody, disagree about morality. And you might get worried that, even the people specially trained to investigate these matters can't agree. So there's several conclusions you might draw from that. One is epistemological. So you might conclude, look, maybe we just don't know the truths about morality. So if you draw an epistemological conclusion, you're not saying that there are no moral facts. There are no moral truths. Just if there are any, we don't know about them. And so strictly speaking, those kinds of arguments aren't arguments for moral nihilism. They're arguments for moral skepticism, which is the view that we can't know the truth about morality. There are metaphysical conclusions that you might draw from all this disagreement that you look at. So one thing you might conclude is just that there are no facts about morality. That explains why no one can agree about them. It's because there's no truths out there guiding our judgments. It's sort of like, apparently in the old days, people used to argue about whether the moon was male or female. They couldn't agree about it. One explanation for why they couldn't agree is just because there is no fact of the matter about whether the moon is male or female, and so there's no truth that they were grasping and getting a hold of, and so that's why they didn't agree. So you could think the same thing about morality. So just as there's no truth about whether the moon is male or female, the universe just doesn't contain sex facts about moons. Similarly, you might think, look, the world just doesn't contain facts about how you ought to live. You might like for there to be such truths, but the world just doesn't cooperate. There just are no such truths. So that's a metaphysical conclusion. I should say in passing, you could also draw a semantic conclusion. I don't consider those in this paper, but I do in other parts of my dissertation and other papers that hopefully will be coming out. You might conclude, oh, well, maybe we're just like talking past each other. So maybe all our moral disagreements are the result of us just having different views. So when we disagree about justice, what is what is the just state like? You might think, actually, some people just mean by justice something like what John Rawls meant, which is like what people would agree to behind the veil of ignorance, whereas other people like libertarians have something in mind like what Nozick had. And so they just have different conceptions. And so when they argue about justice, they have two different ideas in mind. And so they're just talking past each other. It would be like if a British person and an American person were arguing about football, but one had in mind like soccer and the other had in mind like football, American football. They just wouldn't even be talking about the same thing. You might conclude that also. So in any case, I separate them by the kind of conclusion that you want to draw. Some people just want to draw conclusions about what we know and what we don't. Other people want to conclude about what exists. Those are the metaphysical arguments.
Perfect. Okay, so even though you lay out 4 different versions of this argument in the paper, you have this kind of broad response that can apply in each case. And so before we get down in the specifics of each argument, I kind of want the audience to just grasp hold of this broad response. So can you just lay that out? What is your broad strategy for responding to arguments for moral disagreement?
Sure, yeah. So as I say, moral arguments for moral disagreement just say, hey, look, all these people disagree about morality, so we should conclude something sort of troubling about morality. Maybe morality is suspect in some sense. And so my general strategy is to say, okay, well, tell me more about this argument. And any argument that you give is going to be a philosophical argument. So it's going to employ philosophical premises, that is, claims that support the conclusion that you want to draw, the skeptical or anti-realistic conclusion, the sort of troubling conclusion about morality. So my general strategy is to say, show me your premises. And in general, well, in every case that I'm aware of, they're going to be philosophical claims that lead to a really strong conclusion about morality, about some really troubling conclusion. But in order to do that, the philosophical claim is almost certainly going to be the subject of lots of disagreement. That's just the way philosophy works. Virtually any interesting philosophical claim is going to be the subject of lots and lots of disagreement. And so in general, my strategy is to say, show me your premises. I'll point out that one of them is highly controversial itself among moral philosophers. And then the suggestion will be, so if you think that disagreement about some claim discredits that claim, then you're going to discredit your own premises, because you're going to have to employ premises that are themselves highly controversial. That's any premise that's going to be strong enough to draw your troubling conclusion is going to be really controversial. And so the trouble is that basically any argument from disagreement you're going to give is going to self-undermine. That is, it's going to discredit itself. And so that's my suspicion about the way virtually any argument from disagreement is going to go. And what I do in the paper is I just show you, look, here's 4 really powerful, really popular arguments from disagreement. They all self-undermine. So the paper's called The Self-Undermining Arguments from Disagreement. And I try to say, look, there's a reason why it's doing that. It's no accident. It's that philosophy in general, not just morality and politics, philosophy in general is highly controversial. There's disagreement everywhere. So any claim you bring up, it's going to be highly controversial. And so if you think that discredits the claim, you're going to discredit your own premises.
Very good. Yeah. So let's see this at work here. So I'm going to pull up the first, well, let me describe what we're going to do now. So we're going to look at the 2 epistemological versions of the argument from moral disagreement. I'm going to pull up the very first epistemological version called the argument from conciliationism. So you've got the argument on your paper. If you want to read it and maybe just break it down, or however you want to unpack this argument, go ahead and do that, and then we can start critiquing it.
Sure. Good. So conciliationism is a view about the epistemology of pure disagreement. So this is a big debate in epistemology. The big question is just this. What should you do when you hold some view about some issue, about some interesting issue, and somebody who you regard as just as smart as you, who knows the arguments just like you do, just as epistemically virtuous, you know them well, they're good-hearted, they're a truth seeker, they disagree with you about that issue? What should you do, epistemically speaking? Should you suspend judgment about it, or is it permissible for you to hold on to your view? A lot of people in that debate, that's a big debate in epistemology, a lot of people in that debate are conciliationists. So they think that what you ought to do is you ought to suspend judgment about any view that's controversial among you and someone that you regard as your epistemic peer. That is somebody who you regard as roughly equally as smart as you and well-informed as you. So this view doesn't entail that you ought to suspend judgment about any issue that's controversial between you and some small child because you're their epistemic superior, you're smarter than them. But if somebody is roughly equally, you regard them as roughly equally smart and well-informed as you, they think, look, you have no reason to think that you're right and they're wrong if you're equally smart and equally well-informed. So you have no grounds for holding on to your view in the face of such disagreement, so you ought to suspend judgment. That's just a general view in epistemology. The argument from conciliationism just says, yeah, that view is true, and guess what? There's tons of disagreement about morality. So the way it goes is like this. If conciliationism is true, then we're rationally required to suspend judgment about any moral claim that is the subject of disagreement among our epistemic. Conciliationism is true. That's premise 2. So we're rationally required to suspend judgment about any moral claim that's the subject of disagreement among our epistemic peers. 4, a very large proportion of our moral beliefs are the subject of disagreement among our epistemic peers. Therefore, we are rationally required to suspend judgment about a very large proportion of our moral beliefs. So a lot of people think, we disagree about like tons and tons of issues. If you take an applied ethics course, basically any interesting political issue, immigration, abortion, capital punishment, redistribution of taxes, anything having to do with what the government ought to be doing or ought not to be doing, those are all going to be highly controversial. So if that's right, then conciliationism says that you ought to suspend judgment about all of those issues. So this would entail full-blown moral skepticism because we for the most part don't disagree about whether you ought to like beat up children or anything like that. But we do agree, but we disagree about a lot. And so if this argument succeeds, it would show that you aren't justified in believing very much at all. I should also say this also extends to your religious beliefs, to your political beliefs, to your metaphysical beliefs, to basically all your beliefs. Conciliationism isn't just about morality, but it takes a more general view and applies it to morality. Okay, great. So that's basically how it works. Do you want me to say or do you want to clarify or anything?
I think that's pretty clear. If it's not, then I'll bring myself in here. If it's not, then you can comment in the chat and I can ask for clarification. But I think you did a good job unpacking it. So how do we respond then to the argument from conciliationism?
Yeah, so just keep in mind the general strategy. The thought is, look, in general, people disagree like crazy about philosophy. You're going to need an interesting claim to get your argument going. What's the interesting claim in this one? It's premise 2. It's the claim that conciliationism is true. Well, guess what? That view itself, this view that you ought to suspend judgment anytime you're in a disagreement with someone who you regard as your epistemic peer, that is itself the subject of disagreement in epistemology. As I've said, this is a big literature. What's going on in that literature? Well, people are arguing about whether or not that's true. Should you really suspend judgment anytime you're in a disagreement with someone? Suppose that you regard someone as your epistemic peer and they say that, hey, I think slavery is fine. I read some Aristotle. I'm pretty convinced by his arguments. So Aristotle famously defended slavery. So prior to the disagreement, you regarded them as your epistemic peer, and now they've just told you that slavery is morally permissible. Should you suspend judgment about it? A lot of people think, no. In that case, what you should do is demote them. You should say, well, I guess you're not my epistemic peer. But conciliationists in general tend to think that it's not permissible, it's not rationally permissible for you to demote someone from the status of epistemic peer merely because they disagree with you. There's a ton more to say about that claim. The point for now is just this. There's a huge literature in philosophy about whether conciliationism is itself the correct response to peer disagreement. That means that claim is itself the subject of disagreement, and so it would undermine itself because it says anytime you're in a disagreement with someone you regard as your epistemic peer, you should suspend judgment about that claim. That claim is itself controversial among really well-trained, well-informed, sharp people trying to get at the truth. If that's right, then that means that you ought to suspend judgment about conciliationism itself, which means you ought to suspend judgment about premise 2 in the argument. And if that's right, then the thought is you shouldn't accept the conclusion of the argument from conciliationism on the basis of the argument because it includes in it a premise that by your own lights you can't rationally believe. If you accept conciliationism, you shouldn't believe premise 2 of that argument.
Yeah.
But if that's right, so that's how the argument undermines itself. If you did endorse premise 2, you'd have to give up premise 2 because it's itself the subject of disagreement.
Okay, good. Okay, so we saw the broad strategy at play in this specific version, which is an epistemological version of the argument for moral disagreement. Let's look at another epistemological version, a different one. You call this the RAD, because it's the reliability argument from Disagreement. So can you tell us about this one?
Sure. So the broad thought here is just this argument says, look, I'm not talking about pure disagreement. I don't care about that. What I'm interested in is this. It looks like philosophers are using some kind of method to come to their conclusions about morality. Whatever that method is, it must not be very good, because they use it and then they come to all sorts of different conclusions. But that suggests that they're using this method, and tons of them are coming to false beliefs, because not all of their logically incompatible views can be correct. So they must be using a bad method. But if you're using a bad method to come to conclusions, and you know that, then you can't be justified in believing the outputs of that method. So what is the method of moral philosophy? A lot of people think that it's this method called reflective equilibrium. So that's just, what is reflective equilibrium? It's just a process that you actually know, you just don't know it by that name. It's just this, if you take an ethics class, you'll sort of be engaged in reflective equilibrium throughout. It's the method of looking at everyday cases about morality, making intuitive judgments about them, and then trying to explain them by formulating general principles that would explain why that instance is the correct moral verdict or whatever. And then trying to bring coherence between the general principles that you endorse and the particular cases that you endorse. And sometimes you'll endorse a general principle, but you'll see that it has like really crazy implications for particular cases. And so what you'll have to do is you'll have to revise your principle. And sometimes you'll have a judgment about a particular case, but it doesn't explain your principle, so you got to change your principle. Okay, so in general, that's the sort of method that people use. And then the people who endorse the RAD think, yeah, that's a bad method because it comes to all sorts of different conclusions. So here's how that argument works. Do you want me to read the argument?
Yeah, that worked well last time.
So it goes basically like this. If there is widespread fundamental moral disagreement, then many people would have significant false number of moral beliefs, even if they had flawlessly employed our best method of moral inquiry. So this idea is just this. Lots of people, even if they flawlessly employed reflective equilibrium, would come to all sorts of different conclusions. And that's because a lot of people have just differing moral intuitions. They have different starting points. And so if you have different starting points and you engage in reflective equilibrium, you're going to come to different conclusions, even if you use reflective equilibrium perfectly. Okay, so if there is widespread fundamental moral disagreement, then people would have a significant number of false beliefs, even if they were flawlessly to employ our best method of moral inquiry. That's premise 6. Premise 7, if many people would have a significant number of false beliefs, even if they were to flawlessly apply our best method of moral inquiry, then that method is not reliable for many people. If one is aware that our best method of moral inquiry is not reliable for many people, then one cannot be justified in believing the outputs of such a method unless one has special reason to believe that it is reliable in one's own case. It is not the case that any of us has special reason to believe that our best method of moral inquiry is reliable in our own case. So no one has reason to think that they're the best at using reflective equilibrium. Therefore, if we become aware of widespread fundamental moral disagreement, then we cannot be justified in believing the outputs of our best method of moral inquiry. So one thing to say about this argument is that it entails like full-blown moral skepticism, because it just says, look, if you have a method and it leads to all sorts of crazy results, then it's not reliable, and so you shouldn't believe any of the outputs of that method. But basically, all of our moral beliefs are the outputs of that method, and so all your moral beliefs are unjustified. So what should we say about that? So this just talks about moral disagreement, but there's no reason to restrict it specifically to moral disagreement. I mean, we could equally just replace moral with epistemic, and then we could get a reliability argument from disagreement going against epistemology as well. So guess what? In epistemology, people disagree like crazy, roughly as much as they do in about morality. They also use reflective equilibrium. It's basically the exact same method. They reflect on general principles and particular cases and try to bring coherence between those. And they come to all sorts of different conclusions in epistemology. Epistemologists disagree like crazy, just like moral philosophers do. So if we accepted the RAD, then we would have to apply it also to epistemology. But if we did that, then the result of the argument would be that none of our epistemological beliefs are reliable. Or are justified. But here's the problem. Premise 8 and premise 9 of this argument are epistemic claims. So if you endorsed this argument that none of our moral beliefs are justified, you'd also have to endorse the claim that none of our epistemic beliefs are justified, but that includes not our beliefs in premise 8 and premise 9. So that means that if you endorse the rad, you will undermine your own justification for belief in premise 8 and 9, which means that the argument will undermine itself. So if you accept it for morality, you need to accept it for epistemology. But if you accept it for epistemology, you'll undermine your epistemic claims, which is 8 and 9 in the argument.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't really have so much to add to that because you're doing a good job of explaining it. Again, if we're not clear about something, then please type in the chat. I'll try to pause Eric and we can unpack it more. But I think you're doing a good job so far. So,
I just say, just very high level, for that argument, the thought was, hey, you guys have a bad method. It's leading to all sorts of crazy results. And the thought is just, that method, that's the same method that's used in epistemology, and they have all sorts of crazy results. So if you want to get skeptical about morality, you need to get skeptical about epistemology, and then you lose your argument. Okay,
that's a good way of framing it, it. Okay, so then those were two arguments from epistemology. But now we want to shift to arguments from metaphysics. Okay, so an argument from moral disagreement against the, I guess, metaphysical reality of moral facts. There are no facts out there. The first two that we just looked at were, there may be facts out there, but if there are, we couldn't know it. That's the idea. Yeah. But now it is, no, there actually are no facts out there. Okay, so the first one is called the argument from the history of moral philosophy. So you can do the same thing we've been doing, unpack it, and then critique it.
Yeah, sure. So it's called the IBE Argument from the history of moral philosophy. So IBE stands for inference to the best explanation. So the way this sort of argument gets going is it goes like this. It says, hey, look, since Plato and probably before that, people have been arguing about what the true moral theory is. They haven't agreed. In fact, we've come up since Plato with tons more moral theories. And so any particular moral theory has the allegiance of only a small fraction of moral philosophers. And then the question is well, what would explain that? What's the best explanation for why these people who are supposed to be trained in investigating the moral truths can't agree about anything? What's the best explanation for that? The thought is, this argument comes to the conclusion, the best explanation is that there are no moral truths. So this is sort of the kind of argument that I hinted at the beginning. The best explanation is that there's no truths out there. That's how this one works. And so here's roughly how it goes. If there is, so this is an argument from Brian Leiter, who may be known to some of your listeners. He's a very prominent figure in philosophy, not entirely for his metaethics, but for other reasons. But in any case, here's how Leiter's argument goes. If there is long-standing, intractable disagreement among the supposed experts about a subject matter, then the best explanation for the existence and character of that disagreement is that there are no facts about that subject matter. And guess what? There is long-standing, intractable disagreement among the supposed experts about ethics, that is, moral philosophers. Therefore, the best explanation for the long-standing, intractable disagreement among moral philosophers is that there are no facts about ethics. Great. So, if you're just keeping in mind the general strategy is, okay, great, here's a philosophical argument. Are any of the claims here really, really controversial? So, of course, this points out that ethics is the subject of lots of disagreement. That is no doubt true. I don't deny that. But we should ask this. It comes to a metaphysical conclusion. Question, is metaphysics the subject of intractable disagreement over the long history of moral philosophy? Answer, yeah, it sure is. Also, is epistemology the subject of long-standing intractable disagreement over the course of history of philosophy? Yeah, it sure is. So basically what I want to say is, look, premise 11 in this argument is either, I'm not sure if it's a metaphysical or epistemological claim. It's a claim about what the best explanation for some sort of observation is. That's either a metaphysical or epistemological claim. In any case, metaphysics and epistemology are the subject of long-standing disagreement over the history of moral philosophy. So if what you should conclude from such disagreement is that there are no facts of the matter about that subject matter, well, guess what? You've got to conclude that there are no facts of the matter about metaphysics and epistemology. Now, actually, the author of this argument accepts that conclusion. He thinks that actually, yeah, metaphysics and epistemology are a bunch of junk too. But he doesn't see that what he's just done is undermine his own argument. So premise 11, I say, if it's either metaphysical or epistemological, In any case, if you think that some subject matter that's the subject of disagreement over a long period of time, there's no fact of the matter about that subject matter, well, then there's no fact of the matter about metaphysics and epistemology, which means you've undermined premise 11 in the argument, which means it's sort of self-undermined, just like the other ones and just like the next one that's coming up.
Okay, very good. Yeah, that makes good sense. All right, so then the last argument from moral disagreement is called the argument from disagreement in ideal conditions. So go ahead and unpack this one for us.
Sure. So this one gets going like this. A lot of people point out that people disagree like crazy about philosophy, or about morality. What should we do about that? Some more realists come in and say, actually, they're not really moral disagreements. They're more often disagreements about empirical matters. So take, for instance, a lot of political disputes about what the state should and shouldn't be doing. A lot of that depends on economic claims about what will likely happen if we carry out some economic plan or other. Or take the abortion debate. Some people think actually what's at issue there is we just have different empirical beliefs about the nature of fetal development or something like that. So a lot of realists have said, look, it's really just a matter of empirical dispute, not moral dispute. But people endorse this argument, say, no, even if we were to have all the empirical facts, we would still disagree about morality. I actually think that's right. I think they're right. It's not the case that all moral disagreements are just empirical disagreements. So then the thought is, if people, even if they had all the empirical facts, and even if they were reasoning coherently about how to think about ethics, if even they would disagree, then the thought is, then nobody's in a position to know the truths about morality. If even if we were ideally placed, we wouldn't agree about morality. So here's roughly how that sort of argument goes. Premise 14 says, for any action phi, if phi has a moral status, then the moral status of phi is accessible to some possible agent. Some possible agent must be able to know about this fact. For many debates in ethics, the moral status of phi is inaccessible to any possible agent. Now, the reason they think that is because they think even if we had all the moral facts and we were reasoning coherently about it, if you have two ideal reasoners about ethics, and they disagree, and they know that they disagree, then the thought is, if they're ideal reasoners, they'll suspend judgment about which view is correct. But if they suspend judgment about that issue, then they don't know the truth about that issue. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if they don't know the truth about it and they're ideally placed, then the thought is it's not possible for any agent to know the truth about that issue. Okay, so then the thought is, the thought is that's the case for many debates in ethics. Even if we had all the truths, the non-moral truths, even if we knew them, we wouldn't agree about that issue. But that just means we can't know the truth about it. So for many debates in ethics, this is premise 16, phi has no moral status. So many issues about which we argue, there's just no truth of the matter. If 16 is true, then our understanding of morality is deeply flawed and non-skeptical realism is false, because we typically think that these things we're arguing about actually do have a moral status. Mm-hmm. Therefore, our understanding of morality is deeply flawed and non-skeptical realism is false. Okay, great. So the general strategy is, okay, let's find where the controversial claim is. So the first thing to notice is that this is an argument that is about morality. But again, we could extend it to epistemology, or basically any normative subject, that is any subject about what you ought to do or ought to believe or ought to think or ought to feel. So then the thought is this is going to apply to epistemology as well. There are many debates in epistemology. So many of the debates that happen in epistemology are not the subject of disagreement merely because of some empirical disagreements about what the world is like. They're just deeply philosophical disagreements. So then the thought is, look, it's also the case in epistemology that even if we had all the empirical facts, we would still disagree. But if we would still disagree, then the thought is ideal reasoners would suspend judgment about those issues, which means they can't know the truth about them. But if you can't know the truth about that issue, then the thought is it doesn't have a moral status. I don't know if I said why that's the case, but the thought is, look, if nobody could know the truth about this matter, then it can't be that this matter bears on what you ought to do. But moral facts are the kinds of things that bear on what you ought to do. But if nobody can know the truth about it, then it doesn't bear on what you ought to do. So it doesn't have a moral status. That's the way the argument goes.
Great.
But yeah.
Okay, so then here comes the same strategy, right?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. So then the thought is, look, why would you think that? So premise 15 says, for many debates in ethics, the moral status of flying is inaccessible. That is, you can't know the truth about it. Why would you think that that's true? Well, you could endorse conciliationism. You could think that, look, ideal reasoners, when they disagree with one another, will suspend judgment because about that issue, because they are because they endorse conciliationism. But that is itself a highly controversial claim. It's one that they would likely, the ideal reasoners would disagree about in ideal conditions. If that's right, then then according to this argument, there's no normative status for that claim. That is, there's no truth of the matter about whether conciliationism is correct. But if that's right, then again, premise 15 is going to undermine itself. There are other epistemic principles that you could endorse too to try to support this argument, but the general thought is just going to be all of those are highly controversial claims. And so if the idea is any claim that's going to be the subject of disagreement between ideal reasoners, there's no status for it, well, guess what? That's the truth of basically all controversial epistemic principles as well. So again, the argument's going to undermine itself.
All right, so just to kind of summarize all that, we started out by explaining that an argument from moral disagreement is essentially, at its core, trying to show that because there's so much disagreement among epistemic peers, people that know the same amount of stuff, they know the facts, they know they're equally virtuous, they're seeking for truth. Okay, because there's so much disagreement among epistemic peers like that, then either the facts can't be known or there are no facts. That's kind of the core of the argument from disagreement. Now, the error theorist wants to apply this particularly to morality. But it doesn't have to be just applied to morality. It can be applied to metaphysics. It could be applied to epistemology because there's disagreement in those fields as well. And so your broad strategy is simply to say, if you're going to say that disagreement among epistemic peers implies that we can't know the thing in question or the thing in question doesn't exist, then any argument you give for disagreement or from disagreement, any kind of argument that you give from disagreement of some nature is going to have a premise in it somewhere that is not universally agreed upon. It's going to be the subject of
more than
contention.
that, like highly controversial.
Yeah, it's going to be highly controversial. Yeah. And so we then have to apply your principle to that premise that because there's so much disagreement, we can't know the truth of this, or maybe there is no truth to this. And then the argument undermines itself. That's the idea, right?
Yeah, basically, I don't even need to take my own views and bring them against you. I can just take when you offer the argument, I can just take the views that you accept, the views that you're putting on the table. I can just take those and show you, look, by your own lights, you shouldn't believe the argument that you're endorsing here, because basically all these arguments say, hey, look, all this disagreement discredits the subject matter that you're interested in. And I just want to say, any premise you use to try to show that that's the case is also going to be highly controversial, because that's the nature of philosophy. Philosophers disagree like crazy. So you're going to discredit the principle that you use to try to beat the realists with.
Mm-hmm. All right, very good. So we've got lots of questions in the chat, and many of them are very good. So
sure.
I want to save them for the end, though, so that we don't interrupt the flow. We're kind of at the halfway point, maybe slightly past the halfway point. So I'm planning to ask Eric questions starting at around 8:15. We're doing really good on times. I wasn't sure how fast we were going to flow. So there was a lot to cover, but you're doing a really good job of unpacking it, but not making it too simplistic, but at the same time still keeping it accessible. All right, well, we finished critiquing the argument from moral disagreement, and now we want to look at a different argument that error theorists offer, and that is the argument from queerness. So Jonas Olsen offers a version of the argument from queerness I think you held up a. No, you didn't hold up a book by him. You
No, I
held up
did.
one
Yeah,
by.
I've got it right here.
Okay.
So it's called Moral Error Theory, History, Critique, Defense.
Let me put you up. Hold that up one more time so
Sure.
you can see the whole thing. Yeah, there we go. Moral error theory. Okay. Yeah, you can put it down now. So Jonas Olsen offers a version of the argument from queerness, and you consider it to be the best representative of that argument. So before I put his argument up on the screen, we need to define a few terms that he uses. So one of them is queer, a second is normative, a third is reducible reasons, and then a fourth is irreducible reasons. So run through those four and just tell us what those mean.
Sure. So queerness is a word that was originally used by John Mackie. John Mackie's an Australian philosopher. It was in the 70s. So queer just means weird. So when he offered the argument originally, he was just saying, look, the argument is basically morality is really weird. That's the sense in which he means queer. And he said, look, given its queerness, its weirdness, we should be suspicious that there is any such thing as this morality that people insist exists. So that's basically all queerness means. It just means weirdness.
And I think in the paper you also said ontologically suspicious.
That's right. Yeah. So Jonas Olsen, trying to give more content to what queerness is, says, yeah, if something's queer, it's ontologically suspicious. Because so that's the basic idea. You asked like what does normative mean? Yeah. So something is normative just in case it bears on what you ought to do or what's good or anything having to do with evaluation or what you ought to do, what the world ought to be like. So claims of justice or injustice, what's justified, what's good in terms of what you believe. Obviously, rightness and wrongness are going to be, goodness and badness are going to be normative. So it's those sorts of evaluative kinds of concepts or claims. Those are going to be normative.
Okay, and then the difference between reducible reasons and irreducible reasons.
Sure, yeah. So what Olsen thinks is really queer about morality is that it involves appeals to irreducible normativity. So what is that? Well, to understand that, you need to first understand what reducible normativity is. A lot of people think that you ought not to chew with your mouth wide open when you're eating dinner. Great. Does that mean that like I like ought not to chew with my mouth open because like the universe will get me, or like it's a moral fact that I should? No, it's just reducible to facts about what etiquette prescribes or what it tells you ought to do. So something is reducible just in case it's about norms that people made up, or it's about desire satisfaction. So some people say like you should really go to Florida for vacation. What do you mean I should go to Florida? Well, I just mean what a lot of people mean is like, I just mean like if you're into, nice vacations and like
beaches,
being on the beach,
yeah,
then you should go. That's the only sense in which I mean you should go. It's about desire satisfaction. I don't mean that like, regardless of what you care about, you should go to Florida. I just mean like that. So that's reducible. So irreducible normativity is not reducible normativity. So you have irreducibly normative reasons to do something if and only if you ought to do it regardless of what you care about. And morality, most realists think, is like that. It tells you what you ought to do regardless of what you care about. So you ought not, if there's a kid in a pond right next to you drowning and no one is around to save him except for you, most people think you ought to go save them. What do you mean I ought to go save them? I don't want to go save them or something. It doesn't matter. A lot of people think morality requires that you do it regardless of what you care about or what you're interested in or anything. You ought to go do it. That's irreducible normativity. And a lot of people think morality is that kind of normativity. It provides you reasons for action that apply to you regardless of what you care about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's very helpful. All right, so I think now I can put up Olsen's argument from queerness, and now that we know the vocab that he's using, it will make more sense. So I'll do that now, and you can just explain the argument kind of like we did the others.
Sure, yeah. I can't actually see. Is this a fact is queer?
I'll read it.
Yeah.
I'll read it.
Yeah, read
and okay, so it goes like this. Premise 1, moral facts entail that there are facts that favor certain courses of behavior, where the favoring relation is irreducibly normative. You want to say that in another way?
So the idea is just this, that if you think things are right or wrong, good or bad, just or unjust, then you think that there are things that you ought to do. He puts it in a confusing way. It's basically just this: like, you think there are things you ought to do regardless of what you care about, regardless of what anybody says or anything like that. You ought to do it.
Yeah. Okay. So that's basically premise one, and then premise two is irreducibly irreducibly normative favoring relations are queer. So he's basically saying, yeah, that kind of thing is ontologically suspicious.
Yeah.
And
that's
then
weird.
Premise 3 says, hence, moral facts entail queer relations. And then 4 says, if moral facts entail queer relations, then moral facts are queer. And then 5, the conclusion, hence, moral facts are queer.
Yep, that's right. So I mean, there's more. You could get more careful with it, but basically, the idea is just this: that if you're committed to morality, then you think that there are things that you ought to do, and it's not just about your desire for satisfaction. It's not. There are things you ought to do, and it's not just a sense of which you ought to go to Florida for vacation, and that's weird. And so, notice that the conclusion of this argument is only that moral facts are queer. It doesn't yet get to the conclusion that there are no moral facts. So he's going to do that later. So confusingly, he calls this a queerness argument. It's just an argument that moral facts are queer. And then later he's going to give an argument from queerness, which says, given that moral facts are queer, they don't exist. Mm-hmm. And he hasn't given that just yet.
So then
this is just the...
Yeah. So you, in the paper, you describe it. I'll bring myself in so people can see me too. You describe his argument as having 2 steps. Step 1 is just to say that moral practice is queer.
Yeah.
And then step 2 is to say, step 2 is to offer a debunking explanation of moral practice.
So step 1 is just to show that morality is queer. That's what he does here. He just says, man, that's weird that you ought to do things regardless of what anybody cares about. Where would that come from? So that just establishes that it's queer. And the next step is to say, well, given that that's so weird, probably moral facts don't exist because we can explain why we think that there are things we ought to do regardless of what we care about that doesn't appeal to the fact that there are any such truths about what you ought to do. And his debunking explanation is a familiar evolutionary debunking explanation. He just thinks this: I can tell you why you believe that in morality and why you believe there are things you ought to do regardless of what anybody cares about. It's that having those sorts of beliefs help societies and help individuals survive and reproduce. How would that be the case? Well, because societies need to cooperate with one another. They need to be in good communities so that they protect one another. And if you believe that you really ought not to swindle your friend or your other community member, then that's going to lead to the flourishing of your community. So communities enforce these kinds of norms, and they try to get you to believe that you really shouldn't be taking advantage of other people, even if you really want to take advantage of other people. And so communities sort of enforce these norms, and furthermore, we enforce them on ourselves. So sometimes we're tempted to do things like steal or beat somebody up or kill them and steal and take their stuff. Like hunter-gatherers, early people are tempted to do these things. And the thought is, if you believe yourself that you shouldn't do those things, regardless of anyone cares about, you're going to be a good member of that society. You're going to be liked by them, and you're going to survive and reproduce. And that's all we need to say about why you believe that there is a truth about morality. It's not that there really is any such truth. It's just that it helps you survive and reproduce. Evolution has sort of implanted this belief in you.
Gotcha. Okay, so this is where I think the argument from queerness, at least Olsens' argument from queerness, is when you cash it out, and you do this really well in the paper, once you cash it out, it becomes an argument based on parsimony.
Yep.
So I've got a couple of quotes just to kind of illustrate the point that he's getting at. But before I do that, what is parsimony?
Yeah, so parsimony is just the principle that when you have 2 competing theories, you ought to prefer the one that's simpler in some sense. This often goes by the name Occam's razor, and if I could redo the paper, I would call it Occam's razor in the argument from queerness, because people are more familiar with that term. But a lot of people think, so this is a familiar principle from science to some degree, and people use it in philosophy as well. The thought is, if you have 2 competing theories and they're basically equivalent, you should go with the simpler of the two theories. That's basically what parsimony is. And Olsen is what he's trying to say is, look, my story about why you believe that there's such a thing as morality or irreducible normativity is simpler than the theory that there really is such moral truths.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah. So here's a couple of quotes from Olsen that where he basically explicitly says this. He says, moral error theorists can apply Occam's razor. If our moral practices and beliefs can be explained without appeal to irreducibly normative properties and facts, a theory that dispenses with such properties and facts will have the advantage of being, in this respect, the more ontologically parsimonious theory. So I take him to be saying, look, he's saying, I get that you believe that there are things that are really right and wrong, really good and bad. I get that you believe that. But if I can explain why you believe that without actually having to posit these like facts that exist out there somewhere, then that's a simpler theory. My theory is simpler than your theory that says you believe those things and there are really these facts out there. Especially, he's thinking the non-natural ones are really spooky, weird, that kind of thing.
Right.
Okay, so now, how do you reply to Olsens' argument?
Good. Yeah, you got it right. So basically, we have these two theories. There really are moral truths, and we believe in the moral truths because we're, have some access to them. And then there's Olsens' theory, which is we believe in the moral truths, but they're not really there. It's just evolution doing things to us. Okay, and then his thought is, yep, mine's simpler. Okay, so now here's sort of where we go from here. I mean, appeals to parsimony are very common in philosophy. The truth is they're not very well understood by most philosophers. It's sort of like this article of faith that like parsimony just wins the day. And I remember in my early days of philosophy getting in philosophical arguments with other people. And once parsimony gets thrown out there, most people are just like, oh, I bow down to parsimony. Oh my gosh, like, yeah, parsimony wins. But what the heck like simplicity means is not very well understood. And once you get a sense of what kind of simplicity are you talking about, it becomes less clear about why that theory is more probable, that is more likely to be true than the less simpler theory. So I'm happy to grant that the error theory is in one sense simpler than realism. So it's simpler in this sense that error theorists deny that morality exists, and then the realists accept that it exists. So I guess they have one fewer thing in their ontology. But here's a question we should ask. Is that how we figure out what's true? We just like look at the people's ontology, that is the kinds of things that they think exist. We count up the number of things, and whoever has the lower number, they win. That seems like a goofy way to figure out what's true. I mean, here's another way to think about it. I mean,
it's like golf.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of people, so it's a little bit of a caricature, but almost not. I mean, a lot of philosophers sort of think this way. They think, look, the smallest ontology wins. And there's a question like, why should that be the case? And we'll get through, I'll walk you through some justifications people have offered and show that doesn't help the error theorist. But in general, we should just be suspicious of this move because, I mean, why isn't this the right way to reason? Look, I've lived for a long time on this earth. I've realized that reality is really complicated. So actually, I think that the more things you have in your ontology, the more complicated your ontology, the more likely it is to be true because reality is really complicated. Why would we expect it to be really, really simple? I mean, look, I don't think either of those sort of modes of reasoning are very good modes of reasoning. Hey, I have the fewest number of things in my ontology, I win. Versus, no, I have the most things because I would expect reality to be. I don't think either of those are good. So what we do in the paper, and I should say this is co-authored with a guy named Justin Morton, who's a philosopher at the University of California, Davis. What we do in the paper is we say, okay, why would it be the case that the smaller ontology is that theory is more likely to be true just because you have fewer things in your ontology?
Especially on error theory. I don't know if you were going to say. Especially on error theory. Yeah. So the theist can have one reason for why he would expect that simplicity can make a simpler theory, or simplicity can make one theory more probable than another.
That's right, yeah.
And you can unpack that. But the error theorist, you say, doesn't have access to that kind of theistic explanation for why we would expect simplicity.
That's right. Yeah. If you go back and you look at the history of science and the history of philosophy, when parsimony arguments started getting going, when people appealed to simplicity because they thought that supported their view, it was mostly supported by a theistic view. So a lot of people in the old days thought that, look, the reason we should expect reality to be simple and therefore simpler theories to be true is because of certain facts about God. So take Descartes. Descartes thought that God exists, and that explains why we would expect the laws of nature, so the physical laws, but also the philosophical laws, to be pretty simple. He thought, look, God wants us to understand the reality and subdue the earth, and so in order to do that, what he would do is he would create a world with very simple laws, so that human beings like us could figure them out and do our job of taking care of creation. Okay, well, so that would explain why simpler theories are more likely to be true, because we would expect reality to be simple because God would want it to be that way so we could come to know it. And that's why simpler theories win when there's a tie between two theories. Okay, but that's clearly not acceptable to the error theorists, because error theorists are, as far as I'm aware, universally atheists for the following reason. They think that there are no moral truths, but God is supposed to be a perfectly morally good being. So if you think there's no such thing as moral goodness and badness, you can't think there's a perfectly morally good being, which means you have to think there is no God. So the point is just this: one justification, one reason for thinking that smaller ontologies are more likely to be correct or simpler theories are more likely to be true is because God would want the world to be simple. But that's not available to the error theorists. So Leibniz famously thought that that simpler theories are more likely to be true because he thought that simpler theories or simpler laws are more beautiful, and God would create the most beautiful world. He would create the best of all possible worlds, including the most beautiful world, and the most beautiful world has the fewest number of laws. That's a reason to think that the laws of the philosophical domain and of the laws of nature would be simple. But again, that's clearly not going to be available to the error theorists. So that's not going to be good. Why else would somebody be justified in thinking that simpler theories are more likely to be true? You might think it's just a rule of probability theory that if you have two views, one asserts the existence of something and one denies the existence, that the one that denies the existence is more likely to be true. But as a matter of fact, that's not a law of probability theory because in one sense, both views sort of stick their neck out. So it's not as though, the realist says there is something that exists, namely morality. The error theorist says there is something that doesn't exist. And so they're both equally sticking their neck out. It's just in opposite directions. This is a law of probability. If you remain silent about whether morality exists, then your theory is more likely to be true. So for instance, moral realists in general accept what science says. They just think there's this extra stuff, which is the moral reality. Error theorists accept basically what science says, except they just deny that there is any such thing as morality. If you wanted to be agnostic about whether there's any such thing as morality, you basically accept everything science says, and then you just say, I don't take a stand on whether there are any moral truths at all. Now, that theory is more likely to be true than the other two because it just doesn't take a stand. It's sort of less vulnerable to refutation, and so it's more likely to be true. But notice that view is not error theory. That's where you don't take a stand on morality. But that's not what the error theorist wants to say. So then the thought is it's not a law. So why would simpler theories be true? It can't be because we would expect reality to be simpler, because any sort of justification like that would be sort of theistic in nature. Can't be a law of probability that I assert the existence of something, you deny it, so your view is more likely to be true. Nope, that's not the case. So then the thought is there's not going to be any general justification of parsimony that the error theorist can appeal to sort of beat the realist over the head. There just isn't any such theory, or there is any such justification that's going to do that work.
Yeah, so you spend a lot of time unpacking that in the paper. And you get into global and local justification that the error theorists can try to appeal to. I don't know if you want to go into that detail. Do you?
Yeah, so those justifications of parsimony that I just gave, those are global. That's to say, any when it comes to any theory that we're trying to think about, or any domain that we're thinking about, the simpler theory of two equivalent theories is more likely to be true. Those were all global justifications. They're global because they try to show in any domain the simpler theory is more likely to be true. Now, so there are also local justifications, which is just to say, maybe in general, simpler theories aren't more likely to be true, but there are some cases where simpler theories are more likely to be true than others. So let me just give you one example. Suppose we're in a room and lots of people are coming in. We can't see what the weather is like outside, but lots of people are coming in and they have umbrellas in their hands. Now we have two hypotheses about what the weather is like. I say, I think it's probably sunny outside. And you say, I think it's probably raining outside. And we could ask, which one is the simpler theory? Jordan's hypothesis that it's raining outside, or Eric's that it's not? In one sense, your hypothesis is way simpler. It would explain way more easily why people are coming in with umbrellas. It's because it's raining outside. Well, what is the sense in which yours is simpler? Well, your hypothesis makes it more probable that we would see people coming in with umbrellas. Mine makes it less probable. If it's sunny outside, my hypothesis, it's way less likely that we would see people coming in with umbrellas in their hands than yours. So that's the sense in which yours is more likely. Okay, great. So that's a model for how maybe the error theorists can get their argument going. Maybe they could point to some observation that we see in the world that we would expect if the error theory is true, but we wouldn't expect to see if realism were true. Okay, so that's a nice, and in general, I should just say, in general, that's the sense in which scientists mean parsimony. They mean that on the supposition that a certain hypothesis is true, the observations that we see are more probable than some other theory. Okay, great. So maybe that's an avenue that the error theorists could go. They need to point to some observation that we would expect to see on their theory, but not on realism. Turns out, both error theory and realism don't really make any empirical predictions. Their theories about normative reality, about the non-empirical world. And so all the error theory just says is there are no moral truths. Well, that doesn't make any predictions about what we would expect to see or observe. It just says there's no moral stuff out there. And the realist says there is moral stuff out there. Well, that doesn't really make any empirical predictions about what we would expect to see. So then the thought is, on this justification of parsimony, again, the error theorist doesn't come out on top because they can't point to some observation that we would expect to see on their theory, but not ours. So they don't win on parsimony grounds. So then the thought is, so we went through a ton of, in the paper, you can go read the paper, we go through a ton of stories about what in the world could queerness be. We settle on, it's got to be, the thought is, our theory is more parsimonious. And then we look, well, what sense of parsimony are you guys talking about? We run through a bunch and we show that, look, there's no justification for thinking that their theory is more likely to be true than ours. And so then the thought is, look, it just doesn't come out that the argument from queerness makes the error theory more likely than realism. If anything, it just doesn't do it. It just comes out equal, or it just doesn't do anything. And I'm actually okay with that because basically all I'm trying to do is just play some defense. I have other arguments for realism. At this point, I'm just trying to stave off an argument against realism, which is the argument from queerness. So if it comes out that like nobody wins on the queerness grounds, then that's perfectly fine with me because the error theorist thought, I've got a good argument against you. I just want to say, you don't.
Okay, yeah. So that's let me back up
Sure.
real broadly to the point you just made, and that is that you're a realist. I'm a realist. Specifically, I'm a non-natural moral realist. I think you are as well. Somebody asked that in the chat. We're non-natural moral realists.
That's right.
And the idea is we can have reasons for that realism, but in tonight's interview, all that we're focusing on right now is if somebody offers an argument against our realism. Here's why you think that the realist position is false. We're, like you said, just playing defense and saying, okay, lay out your premises, and then we want to look at them and critique them. And that's what we've been doing. Now, I don't know if you'd be up for it, but I'd love to have you back, and we could look at arguments for moral realism.
Sure.
But that's all we're doing tonight is just basically defense. So returning to this last point, I just want to be clear about this. So if the argument from queerness is really an argument about which views more parsimonious, the error theory or realism, if that is the case, and you make a good case for that in the paper, then when the error theorist tries to appeal to parsimony as the reason that his view is the one that's preferable. The reason that error theory is preferable is because it's more parsimonious. You basically ask, why should I think that the more parsimonious theory is the one that's more likely to be true? And he then needs to give some kind of justification for the principle that the more parsimonious theory, the more likely it is to be true. And you say, for the error theorist, he can appeal, that justification cannot appeal to God. And so there needs to be some other principle at work here.
Yeah.
And
in the background has to be this thought that like we would expect reality to be simple. That's why the simpler theory is more likely to be true. And my question is, wait, why would you expect reality to be simple? Because I know why Leibniz thinks that it has to do with God. I know why Descartes thinks that has to do with God. I want to know why you error theorists who can't appeal to God, why do you think that simpler theories are more likely to be true? Again, you can't appeal to some like probability, some principle of probability theory. Not going to help you. So then the story is like, why would the fact that you assert you deny the existence of something and I assert its existence, why would that make your view more likely to be true? And just to give you a sense, I sort of hinted at like, look, just counting up the number of things that you affirm exist and noting that yours has one less thing in it. That by itself is just sort of like, it makes you sort of like put up your hands and say like, why is the fact that you have one less thing, the number yours is one less, why does that make your theory more likely to be true? And in general, so some people might just think, but parsimony is supposed to be like this really important principle. I don't deny that parsimony is important in science, but I just want to say this. Go look at what the scientists are doing when they appeal to parsimony. One thing they're not doing is counting up the number of things that people endorse or believe exist and seeing who has the higher number or who has the lower number and deciding on that basis. They're doing something much more complicated. And so you should go look at that. And in general, parsimony, by the way, just means simplicity. And so you really need to get clear about what do you mean by simplicity? I mean, here's one way for a theory to be simple. I could write it on the board in just a few letters or a few sentences. So suppose you have two theories. One you can write in just a few sentences, and another takes like a big chunk of the board. Does the fact that one takes more of the board mean that that's more likely to be true? Of course not. So this is just to motivate this thought. The mere fact that your theory is simpler in some respect doesn't mean it's more likely to be true. You need to say more about why that kind of simplicity makes your theory more likely to be true.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so you say that if the error theorist tries to give a global justification for this principle that the more parsimonious the theory, the more likely it is to be true. If he tries to give a global justification, it doesn't work. Now, this is difficult, I know, and I just want you to summarize it again as concisely as possible. In the paper, you spend pages doing this, and so I would encourage everyone, we're simplifying things a lot, go read the paper, but what's the kind of most concise version of why that global justification fails?
So in the history of philosophy, when people have thought that appeals to parsimony are good because we have a background, so in other words, we have a reason to think simpler theories are more likely to be true. That's been because they've assumed that we would expect reality to be simple. And we would expect it to be simple, they thought, because God exists and would want us to come to discover the moral laws because he has certain aims for us. So he wants us, so in the Descartes case, he wants us to reign over and subdue the earth. In the Leibniz case, we would expect it to be the laws of reality to be simple because it's more beautiful that way. That's at least what Leibniz thought. Here's another global justification. You might think like just looking at how many claims are affirmed. So in general, the more claims you affirm, the more likely that your theory is to be false because you're on the hook for more claims. And so my thought was just this. Look, the realist and the error theorist are on the hook for more claims. It's just that one has a not existent. So one says moral truths do exist. The other says moral truths don't exist. The fact that one is for and one is against doesn't mean that your theory is more likely to be true. There's no theorem of probability that says affirming or denying the existence of something makes your theory more or less likely to be true.
Okay, so that's the global justification there.
That's the global justification.
And then the local justification is basically trying to say that, or from the error theorist's point of view, he's saying, look, I can give a local justification. Local meaning within the domain of moral philosophy. I can give a local justification for this principle of parsimony, and that is that I would expect certain things to be the case given the truth of my theory, and those expectations are satisfied more so than what your expectations would be. Now, in the paper, if I remember correctly, you give like what expectations could the error theorist give, and I think you give two in the paper, right?
Yeah. It's been a while since I wrote this paper. I mean, I don't remember exactly. I mean, I guess I would invite people to go look.
Yeah, I think one of them. Well, even if this isn't the one, it's related to what we discussed in the first half. One might be disagreement. I don't remember if you said that or not, but I can imagine an error theorist saying, "Well, look, if there aren't moral facts, I'd expect that there'd be disagreement, and look what I find: disagreement." Yeah. So, how might you? Would you just then go to the first half of the discussion, or is there something else?
Yeah, one move is to say, oh, great, now you just moved it to an inference to the best explanation from disagreement. So you said, hey, look, I think the best explanation for all this disagreement is that there are no facts about morality. That's basically what you said. It's a better explanation than realism. And then I would just say, do you really want to endorse that argument? Because if you do, go see this other article, the one that I just discussed in the first part, which says, look, if you think the best explanation for all this disagreement is that there's no facts of the matter, you'd have to say the same thing about epistemology and metaphysics, and that's going to undermine the premise that you employ to get your argument from disagreement going.
Yeah. All right. So then, just to kind of summarize the overall discussion, we looked at two arguments for error theory, an argument for moral disagreement, and an argument from queerness. We saw that the argument for moral disagreement actually undermines itself because any argument that's given is going to have a premise that's widely disagreed upon. And so we shouldn't accept that premise, so then the argument from disagreement fails. And then the argument from queerness, when it gets cashed out, it seems to be like it's an argument based on parsimony. The error theorist is saying, look, my error theory is more parsimonious than the realist theory. And when you ask, well, why should I care if your theory is more parsimonious? And he says, well, there's this principle that the theory that's more parsimonious is more likely to be true. You can say, what kind of justification can you give for that? And it seems like whether he gives a global justification or a local justification, both fail. And so the error theorist is left without any kind of justification that he should prefer the parsimonious theory, in which case we can say, well, why prefer your error theory now?
Right.
Okay. So that was a fair summary?
Yeah, that's a fair summary. Yeah. And then so again, we're just playing defense here. So the thought is, once you've done that, we're just comparing like the relative merits of two different theories, error theory and realism. So once you've sort of played defense against these two, those are the big arguments for error theory. Then the thought is like, now we're in the clear. We don't need to do a ton of work on the positive side once we sort of dismiss these sorts of arguments. We're not doing the positive side here. But yeah, that's generally right. The thought is, first of all, when somebody offers an argument from parsimony, one, you need to know, okay, parsimony just means simplicity. In what sense is yours simpler? And then they need to specify, here's the sense in which mine's simpler. Again, if it's just something as stupid as, well, mine takes less board space, then I can grant that yours theory is more parsimonious. It's simpler in the following sense. It takes up less space on the board. But the mere fact that it's more parsimonious doesn't mean that it's more likely to be true. So in general, what you want to ask is, what do you mean by your theory is more parsimonious? And then once we get clear about what that is, the general thought is just this. Once you see what they mean, then you can ask, well, why is the fact, well, let's grant yours is more parsimonious in the sense you just specified. Why does that make your theory more likely to be true? And there's not going to be a good answer. I'm not saying there couldn't possibly be. I don't know. I haven't read all the arguments. Maybe a new argument's coming. But so far, of the extant arguments, there's no argument that specifies a sense of simplicity and then shows that kind of simplicity makes their theory more likely to be true.
Mm-hmm. All right. Then I want to go ahead and say, if you've got a question, type it in the chat. I'm going to try and look through the questions that have already been submitted. It will help me find your question very quickly if you begin by putting the symbol and then Crash Course Apologetics. It tags me and I can find it very quickly. So let me go back through. We'll take, if you're okay with it, Eric, just like 15 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Okay. So the very first question 20 Faces asked is his critique rooted in a particular meta-ethical position?
No. Well, no. I mean, so in other words, you don't have to endorse a particular meta-ethical position in order to endorse the things that I say. I mean, obviously they're against error theory. But even error theorists actually can endorse everything I've said because, for instance, Bart Sturmer doesn't advance for error theory either an argument from disagreement or an argument from queerness. So actually, you could be an error theorist and accept literally everything I've said here. You could say, yeah, that's right. All those arguments for error theory, they're bad. Obviously, you can be a realist and do that. You could be a constructivist, a quasi-realist. You could be a relativist. Yep. So no, you don't have to endorse some particular meta-ethical view. I do have meta-ethical views, but my critiques don't depend on them.
Good. All right. So then the next one, Comrade Peep said, is he a naturalist or a non-naturalist?
I'm a non-naturalist. Maybe it's good to say what those
are.
So
explain
a naturalist,
what that term means.
Yeah. So if you're a naturalist about metaethics, you just think that moral properties are identical to some property that is explored by our best natural science, or maybe the completed natural science. So a lot of people think that, for instance, utilitarianism might be a naturalist moral theory because it says that what goodness is pleasure. And you might think that pleasure is just identical to some fact about what your brain is doing. In that case, a moral property, goodness, would be identical to a natural property, pleasure, which is identical to some brain state that you're in. I'm a non-naturalist, which is to say I don't think that goodness or badness, rightness or wrongness or injustice or anything like that is identical to any property that's studied by the natural science. So I think science is great. I love science. I hope scientists continue to do what they do. But I don't think that scientists are ever going to discover the natural properties by bumping electrons into one another or by studying populations of animals or doing anything that the natural scientists do. I just don't think they're going to discover anything about morality that way.
All right, Liz Jackson asked, I'm curious if Eric thinks it is possible to be both a Christian and a moral nihilist.
Thanks, Liz. No, I don't think it is possible. Did she say theist? Did she say traditional theist, or what kind of theist?
She just said a Christian.
A Christian. I guess in some sense you could have, it depends on what you mean by Christian. No, but in general, my thought is no. That's because if you're a Christian, you believe in a being called God, and God is perfectly morally good. So if you believe in something that's perfectly morally good, then you believe in moral properties, but that means that you're not a nihilist. You could be a kind of goofy Christian and, but I don't know, not a very coherent view, I don't think.
All right. Next one, 20 Faces. He asked the very first question. Let's see. He said, well, hold on. I'm having trouble making sense of that. 20 Faces. Okay. I think he hints at this later too. He's basically asking, since this argument from disagreement, implies that we, if something's disagreed upon, then we have to kind of suspend judgment on it. Maybe even it doesn't exist. Then he's saying that wouldn't just apply to moral beliefs. That would apply to all of the error theorists' beliefs. And so how can they, if they endorse that argument, how can they know anything? Yeah.
It wouldn't apply to all of their beliefs because we don't disagree about everything. It depends. Actually, it depends on how exactly the argument works. I mean, if the argument is like from disagreement about some particular thing, and then just says, well, all your beliefs about that subject matter are junk, then maybe error theorists would be in bad shape. But in general, we don't disagree about traffic laws or about, I don't know, certain physical things. So it wouldn't undermine lots of their physical beliefs, beliefs about I don't know, tables and chairs and things like that. But it would undermine a lot, basically everything that is the subject of disagreement. So that's going to be a lot of your philosophical beliefs, especially your beliefs about atheism or error theory or metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of science. A lot of your scientific beliefs are going to be like that because scientists themselves disagree, at least at the foundations of science, they disagree about a lot of stuff, and those beliefs would be undermined.
All right. So 20 Faces asked a follow-up question. He says he's writing an essay on error theory right now, so you're helping him out.
Great.
He said, doesn't Mackie imply that disagreement is an issue for moral objectivism, specifically because he thinks moral objectivism entails motivational internalism?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we didn't discuss Mackie's particular arguments, but yes, that is something that Mackie is concerned about. So, but actually no one after Mackie is concerned about that because they think it's a really bad argument. But basically, here's what Mackie thought. He thought moral properties are such that once you recognize them, you're thereby motivated automatically to act in accordance with them. So if you recognize that you ought to give to charity, then you're just going to be like pulled, regardless of what you care about, you'll be pulled to like help to give to charity or to help some kid who needs your help. But no one thinks that that's true. I mean, I think most people think, especially realists, they think, no, you could perfectly well recognize that something is right or wrong, good or bad, and not act in accordance with it because you're either morally bad or you're just you're vicious. Or some people think that there are such things as amoralists. That is, people who recognize things as good or bad and just don't care about it. Or even immoralists, people who recognize something as good or bad and then act against it because they don't want to do the right thing. They do the bad thing for its own sake. In any case, no one thinks that no realist is committed to this thought. Once you recognize that that there is some moral property, you're motivated to act in accordance with it.
All right, so this is a question for me from Brando and Liz. Will I do karate? So this is the best you get.
Yeah, do it.
No one's asked me to do that before. So, but Brando, unfortunately, Brando said this conversation got a little dry and was a snooze for him. But for me, I was really enjoying it. I can't imagine there being things much more important, because if it really is something on the table as serious as there is no good, there is no bad, there is no right, there is no wrong, my goodness, those motivate so many of our actions in life. That just seems like we have to dig into the details and wrestle with that kind of view. So nonetheless,
I know some people get bored by error theory because they don't find it the least bit plausible, and so they're just not even like concerned with it or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, serious time. Okay, so let's see. I'm saving Tim Saunders' question for near the end. Let's see. I'm scrolling down here. Okay. 20 Faces asked, what about the issue of ethical supervenience and the fact moral objectivity entails we posit some weird faculty of moral perception?
Good. Yeah, we didn't get to this. Those are because we were mostly considering Jonas Olsens' argument from queerness, but that's right. Mackie has these two other sorts of ideas about what queerness might consist in. One is this idea that it's very weird, the fact that moral properties supervene on natural properties. What that means is it's very weird that every time somebody burns a cat, badness is instantiated. Why is that? If the moral properties are totally different than the natural properties, why is it that they're like in perfect correlation with one another? They're not identical to one another. They're like totally different kinds of properties. So why would they always sort of why would the badness always come with cat burning? Or why would wrongness always come with lying? Mackie thought that was really queer. And so that was sort of one line of his argument from queerness. A lot of people think that's not a very good way to go, either because that can be explained by moral principles. So the moral principles specify when the properties are going to be attached to certain non-natural or to certain natural states of the world. And then some people just think that that argument depends on a claim called Hume's dictum, which is the view that two properties can't be necessarily correlated unless they're identical. But a lot of people think that view is false, that they could be correlated even though they're not identical. And then the other one was, So a lot of people have worried that if moral facts are non-natural, that is, they're not identical to any sort of scientifically respectable facts, how would we even know about them? We have flesh and blood brains. How do we get in contact with the truths? We would need some really weird form of intuition, but it doesn't seem like we have that. When we investigate our bodies, we don't find like some moral faculty in there, which we can sort of take out and see like how it connects up with the moral truths. But a lot of people think that's not a good argument because at best it would vindicate moral skepticism, the view that we can't know the truths about morality, but it wouldn't vindicate moral error theory, the view that there are no moral truths.
Mm-hmm.
But those are concerns that Mackie has, but they haven't been that influential. They've been more influential in this sense. There's sort of an invitation to do some moral epistemology. Tell us how we come to know the truths.
Yeah. Okay, so Liz Jackson asked, what does Eric think about divine command theory?
Yeah, ambivalent. I would like for it to be true, but I'm not. As of right now, I'm not a divine command theorist. I got into metaethics thinking divine command theory was true. I'll tell you, in general, I just think, and this isn't decisive at all, but I just think that the normative domain is just so vast that it's not going to be captured by facts about what God commands or doesn't command. In the following sense, in addition to there being moral facts about what we ought to do and goodness and badness, there are facts about what we ought to believe. There are facts about what governments ought to do. There are facts about what we ought to feel or what we ought to fear or what we ought to hope for. And it could be that all of these are sort of somehow explained by God's commands. I'm not saying it couldn't possibly be that way, but it's just hard to see how that's going to work out. Again, that's not just to say I can't imagine how that would go. And so that's why I haven't been a divine command theorist myself, though if somebody convinces me it's true, I'll be happy that it's true.
Yeah. I'm not sure if divine command theory. I'm still investigating this. What I will say is I interviewed, for those watching, if you're interested in learning more about divine command theory, I interviewed Dr. Matthew Flanagan on it, and he does a very good job of defending it. And so I think I raised like 11 objections in that video, and we go through each one. So I think the title of it's just Divine Command Theory. So you can go and check that out. What was really interesting to me was my last interview, the previous one, was with Adam Johnson, and he has a Trinitarian metaethical theory, and that one's really, it appeals to me. That one has a lot going for it, I think. So you can go and check out that interview as well. I think it's called Proposing a Trinitarian Metaethical Theory. Let's see. A few more questions if you're okay. We got lots. This is a good turnout. Okay. In Deerish, something like that is his YouTube name, said, can you give just an overview on some of the other or just one of the strongest arguments for moral nihilism that someone can posit? So you already mentioned kind of Mackie's, but you're like, his are more invitational. They're not necessarily considered the strongest.
Yeah. What are some other arguments that people give? So one, this is very similar to Olsens, and I sometimes struggle to see what the difference is, but Richard Joyce has an argument from reasons internalism to error theory. So he basically argues that if there are reasons for action, they have to be in some way about what we care about or what we want or about desire satisfaction. But the moral truths are totally independent of desire satisfaction. So there are no moral truths. That's very similar to Olsens. They claim that they're different, but okay. In this one, Bart Schumer sort of has a multi-step argument for the error theory. First, he argues that the moral truths have to be identical to natural properties, and he does that by invoking this general metaphysical principle about property identity. It's a very complicated argument, but first he argues that moral properties have to be identical to natural properties, and then he tries to argue that moral properties are not identical to natural properties, so there are no moral properties. So it's a multi-step argument. Along the way, there's like a whole bunch of moves. I don't find it terribly plausible because like there's so many metaphysical principles that you have to buy in order to get to the conclusion that there are no moral truths. And I'm inclined to just say, yeah, I'm I'm much more confident that you shouldn't pick up a cat and throw it in a fire than I am that this whole host of metaphysical principles leading to the error theory is true. So I'm just inclined to say, yeah, I bet one of those metaphysical principles is false and that it really is bad to throw cats in fires.
Let me ask you related to that. So I think that what's her name? Antony.
Oh, Louise
Antony. And Richard Swinburne, I know William Lane Craig says this, and some others, and that is that any argument for moral nihilism is going to have a premise in it that is less obvious than my knowledge that burning a cat for fun is wrong or torturing a child for fun is wrong. What do you think about that kind of response? Do you think that...
I love that. Yeah, no, I love it. I actually have a paper on it. So some error theorists are familiar with those sorts of arguments. Those are called Morean arguments. It's a long story, but basically you got the strategy down. It's the way to respond to any, and it's not just error theory, it's any eliminativist view. So some people think that there are no beliefs. Some people think that there is no such thing as consciousness. There are all of these sorts of things that philosophers are, deny on the basis of philosophical arguments. In general, the way to respond to those is to say, okay, cool. Like you wheeled out a ton of philosophical premises to get to this like pretty crazy conclusion. My guess is that we really are conscious, that there is such a thing as consciousness, and that one of your philosophical premises is false. I think those are great. The error theorists are familiar with those arguments, and and here's their strategy. They try to take the claim that you think is obvious and try to debunk it. That is, try to show why it seems plausible to you, but it's not. But it has to do with matters that are totally independent of its truth. And so I have a paper which I'm developing now where I basically try to go and look at those debunking arguments and try to show, like, look, either the debunking argument itself fails, or we can just tweak the claim that we think is obviously true, and we could still get the conclusion that we're after. So yeah, in general, I think that is a great way to go. And I think it's just a mark of philosophical good sense to not accept really drastic conclusions on the basis of philosophical arguments with tons of premises, because it's often just the case that it's more likely that one of those premises is false than that you're not conscious, or that there's no such thing as beliefs, or that there's no material objects or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And that was related to who brought it up. Someone here in the comments, I'm sorry I can't find you, mentioned, what do you think about a Morean shift? And so
I love it. I think it's honestly, I think it's the best argument there is for realism. It's not a very philosophically sophisticated argument. That's why it doesn't get you're not going to see it in like the big journals, a Morean argument for moral realism. But it's just philosophical good sense, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. If you're okay with it, just a few more, we're winding down here. So, and this is kind of related to the kind of debunking story. So Tim Saunders has just a few questions. I'll read it, and then if it's not clear, I can kind of get at the idea. So he says, is morality observable in animal societies? Is our version of morality distinctively unique in comparison to the animal version, or is ours just a more progressive derivative of the animals? And then earlier in the conversation, he had asked something like this, and it gets at the debunking story. I'm sorry, I'm pulling it up now. He said, is the idea that could empathy be explained just through evolution? Our belief that, be empathetic and so on, or does it come from God? And the idea is, if I can explain why we would have empathy just through evolution, why do I need to posit that, there are really things I should do based on empathy? Something like that.
So I don't know about animal morality. I don't know if they have, if they respect certain moral norms or anything like that. So I can't really say. To Can empathy be explained evolutionarily? I think probably, yeah. But that doesn't yet tell us about, whether or not there's a God, because it could be that God used evolution to give us a sense of empathy or something like that. Also, empathy is a pretty crude instrument. So being empathetic doesn't yet, you're not going to be able to generate all the things that about morality that we think are true merely from our being empathetic. A lot of things, for instance, we have norms about who you should be empathetic towards. That is like, if somebody is an abuser of, a wife abuser or something like that. In general, we don't think like, oh, I understand the frustrations that you were going through, and I, see why you should, you did that. In general, we think, no, what you did is morally wrong, and like you should go to jail, and in general, like it's not clear how the mere fact that we're empathetic is going to generate all the things that we think are true about what human beings ought to do, but also what institutions ought to do. You're not going to get political philosophy straight out of the fact that we're empathetic. So
yeah. I will say maybe not many people know this about me. I might have said it before. Before I was a high school biology teacher, I was a lab tech, and I studied termites. And so the specific behavior that I studied in termites was this thing called policing behavior, where when a worker termite becomes basically they become a reproductive. They're able to reproduce. They can turn into a queen. The problem is multiple ones turn into queens at the same time, and then they fight over that position, and then whoever is killed, sometimes they bury that individual, and then sometimes they cannibalize it. So the idea is this, though. The eusocial insects are really, I think, a helpful kind of comparison for morality, because they have a system that helps their flourishing. There's way more flourishing of termites on this earth than there are humans. way more. But they go by completely different rules than us. But like eating one another, and they can still bury one another, but if one of them becomes reproductive, you kill it. There can only be one queen. And so anyway, the point is, I think that that the theist doesn't have to worry about some kind of evolutionary debunking story, because like you said, God could have guided the evolutionary process so that the moral beliefs that humans come to hold they match up to objective morality. But on a naturalistic view, or that's probably not even the best, in a view without any reference to God, there's no mind behind the process, it's just happening, then there just doesn't seem to be anything particularly valuable about humans, the flourishing of humans, over the flourishing of termites or some other animal. And so I definitely don't think you're going to get our moral beliefs just straight out of evolution. You're going to get a bunch of different moral beliefs. So for whatever that's worth.
I think, moral epistemology gets really, really hard if you don't think that there's a God. I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm not saying that, skepticism follows. But in general, I like, when it comes to moral arguments, I'm not a big fan of William Lane Craig's, but I am a fan of the ones that are arguments from moral knowledge that sort of, sort of show that the best way, at least, that we're going to come to have moral knowledge is because of God's sort of doing something to help us get it.
Yeah. All right. Well, that will end the interview tonight. Did you have anything else you wanted to say before you take off?
No, I appreciate you asking me to be here and read my papers and putting them out there for people. I really appreciate it.
I told Eric that after reading these papers, I'm now a big fan of his. I think he does really excellent work. So I really hope that you, Eric, will come back on. We can discuss it later. But I'd love to interview you about arguments in favor of moral realism.
Sure.
So hopefully we can make that happen. And please, I've got some really cool interviews coming up. One is with Liz Jackson. She's in the chat. She had a debate recently with Cosmic Skeptic about Pascal's wager. If you know anything about my channel, you know that I love Pascal's Wager, at least certain versions of it. And so she's going to come on, and I will interview her about kind of cosmic skeptic strategy in that debate, and whether that was successful or not. I'm also going to be interviewing Dr. Andrew Moon about Reformed epistemology. I think in 5 days, really soon, maybe the end of the week. So stay tuned for that. I've got lots of interviews that I've already done previously on the moral argument with David Baggett, Terence Cuneo, Matthew Flanagan, Adam Johnson, Paul Copan. So you can go and check those out. I think that you'll enjoy it. So with that said, have a good night. Please, before you go, I'll put this. It would really help support me if before you leave, you like this video and click the subscribe button and turn on the bell. These days, the bell is more important than even the subscribe button. It will help grow my channel. I'm getting super close to 1,000 subscribers, and that would once you hit 1,000 subscribers, YouTube gives you these extra features that would be really cool to have, to where I can interact with the audience more. So I really appreciate it. Eric, if you'll stick around for just a minute, we can talk briefly. But to everyone else, good night.